Hello and welcome to a leadership training presentation entitled Your Church's Life Cycle. The objectives of this training are to view the church through the systems theory called the life cycle, develop an awareness of the four basic functions of the church, understand the four phases of the life cycle and your particular church's position on the life cycle. And then lastly, we want to draw some conclusions for ministry as we look at the church through this particular lens. Now, the primary source for this presentation comes from George Thompson's book, How to Get Along with Your Pastor, Creating Partnership for Doing Ministry. As we get started, we want to look at the presuppositions behind this theory, the background, what this theory supposes before it even gets started. And the first thing that this lens, this particular cultural analysis assumes is that all organizations exist in culture. That all culture changes over time, and therefore all organizations must adapt to the changing culture to maintain vitality. Now, this would be true of organizations, it would be true of clubs, it's true of schools, of churches, of hospitals, any organization you can imagine. This theory supposes or presupposes that every organization exists in a culture, and culture evolves or changes over time. And if the organization is going to maintain its health, it must adapt to the changes in the culture. Now let's look at the four functions of church as Thompson describes them in his book. The first is perform. This has to do with the church's role in worship, in education, in nurture, and in reaching out into the community. Execute. This describes or captures the role and duties of the church that relate to the business of the church. So, for example, employees or staff, the church's polity or particular governance or their how they're structured, their teams, their committees, their councils, their boards, when they meet, how they meet, and what kind of ministries they plan. So basically just the execution of doing the business of church. Relate. How the church relates to its members and its non-members. And the last is envision. You can imagine an organization or a business or a church existing without a vision or a purpose. Well, envision is the function of the church that describes and captures why it exists. What is the church's purpose? What is the church's vision? Why do they exist in the community they exist in? So those are the four basic functions of the church as Thompson describes them. Now let's look at the life cycle. This is really the heart of Thompson's argument or his discussion in chapter 2. Now, this is a graph of a church life cycle. This is a simple graph with 4 points. Any research on the internet or looking at other graphs, you can find life cycle graphs with a lot of other points of reference. But this is the simplest, and this one follows very closely with Thompson's book and what he's capturing in chapter 2. We begin on the left side of this graph with what this graph calls new church. Thompson labels it the up-and-coming church. As the up-and-coming church becomes more established and they continue to grow, they become dynamic. This is a solvent or healthy church. At some point, a church, or you can imagine a business or organization, will peak, and then they become established. In the graph we have, they have labeled it a declining church. And then the dying church is what Thompson calls the weakening phase. Now let's look at each of these phases in just a little more detail. The new church, or the up-and-coming church, is characterized by performance. Their main priority is to perform. The solvent or dynamic church, all functions are working in balance. This is really where any organization wants to be, is in the solvent or healthy phase, the dynamic phase of their existence, where they're executing, performing, relating, and envisioning. All of the functions of the organization are in harmony, they're in balance, and they're all working together. Now we move to the right side of this graph. The declining or establishing church is characterized by autopilot. They have experienced the joy and exhilaration of being a healthy, solvent, successful, growing, dynamic church, and things peak. And as they peak, they begin to move into what Thompson calls autopilot. Energy of the congregation and the leadership in the church begins slowly turning in to focus primarily on themselves, those they've captured. And pastoral care of members is emphasized. This is key. The pastor becomes the caretaker of the members and the different circles and families that exist within the church. Now, characteristics of the dying or weakening church: crisis. They're in a mode of crisis. Fear is one of the main emotions in this phase because there is measurable decline in all the areas that you can measure, from worship to participation to budget to membership. Everything's declining, and it seems as though there's no end. And another characteristic is they continue to work the old paradigm with no results. So they continue doing what made them successful in the past and what made them healthy and solvent and dynamic, but it's not working anymore. And as we would assume, the reason we're looking at the graph and we're studying our church in this manner is because the culture has shifted. And when the culture shifts, changes, this particular church that's on the dying or weakening phase has not adapted. Now, as you look at this graph, the answers, the strategies to move from a declining church or a dying church to a solvent and healthy church are evident. I mean, there's no secret. There certainly are steps in getting there, but there's no secret. The key is to move into a position where all the functions of the church are working in harmony, are working in balance. Now let's look at a few conclusions. The first is vision. The key strategy for a weakening church, a declining church, a dying church, to move from that phase back into the dynamic, healthy, solvent stage is vision, to recapture a vision for the future. And then what we want to look at is dynamic, that dynamic phase. This is ultimately where organizations, businesses, and churches want to exist. The healthy, solvent, dynamic stage where all the functions, executing business, performing excellence, relating to both members and non-members, and casting a vision are all on the same page and working in harmony. This is when a congregation and a church becomes vital. I hope this presentation has helped as we look at the church through a cultural lens of the life cycle. Thank you.